Where does Poland stand today?
Is the mood shifting now when it comes to the war in Ukraine? This is, in fact, a destroyed country, or a partially destroyed country, with a traumatized population. Europe is not acting in its own interest when it comes to its policy toward Russia and Ukraine, because it was in our interest to preserve a neutral Ukraine as it was. That is why the first requirement is to take a self-critical look at who we are and at the policies we have pursued in the past, especially in the recent past, and to change those policies. And I believe that is the basic requirement. The second requirement is that, in the medium and long term, we must break away from the United States.
And once again, the saying holds true. The rich supply the weapons, the poor supply the corpses.
It is hard not to believe it, hard to resist it, and therefore hardest of all to say no. It is difficult not to be a pawn in their game.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Against the current. About the person. Hello, and welcome to Against the Current. I present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keeps silent about. Polish Colonel Ryszard Kuklinski was one of the most important agents of the Cold War. From 1972 to 1981, he handed over more than 40,000 top-secret Warsaw Pact documents to the CIA. Then the Americans exfiltrated him. Today, Colonel Ryszard Kuklinski has been posthumously promoted to general and is buried at Połański, the Polish military cemetery, 100 meters from the grave of former communist head of state and party leader General Jaruzelski. There are fresh flowers on both graves every day. I made a film about this, which you can watch at patrickbob.de. And during filming, I came to understand that in Poland, many things from the past still have not been dealt with, and that there are quite a few divisions running through the country. The situation is similar when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Official Poland stands firmly by Ukraine's side, but among the population, things sometimes look very different. Where does Poland stand today? I'm discussing that with Polish journalist and publicist Jan Opielka. He edited this book with Russia for a change in policy, which is also, and above all, about the war in Ukraine and the possibilities for reaching a peace agreement. Hello, Jan Opielka. Good afternoon. Where does Poland stand today? Is public opinion shifting now when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
Yes, I think we may need to distinguish between what politics is doing and how political attitudes may be changing there, and on the other hand, what is happening among the population. Of course, the two are connected and can reinforce each other. And among the public, the mood may not have completely turned, but the proportions have shifted significantly. At the beginning of the war in 2022, people's solidarity was very strong. It was truly enormous. People took Ukrainian refugees into their homes, and not just in isolated cases. Overall, it was probably 2 million adult Poles who took in Ukrainian refugees and helped in other ways as well.
Ukrainische Flüchtlinge bei sich aufgenommen haben und auch anderweitig geholfen haben und eine große Zustimmung war und auch Akzeptanz.
And there was very, very strong support and acceptance, because people understood, okay, the perspective was, we understand you because we know that Russia is an aggressor. That was the perspective. And now this is happening to you, so we're helping. That was more or less how the public saw it. After 4 years, that has changed quite significantly. And that has to be said. Even though the Ukrainian refugees living in Poland, as well as Ukrainians who were already in Poland before the war, there were about 500,000 Ukrainians in Poland before the war, are actually relatively well integrated. In terms of employment alone, their employment rate is almost the same as that of the Polish population. That is different in Germany. The number is significantly lower when it comes to employment. The Polish state has created the appropriate opportunities and in very, very many areas has effectively given Ukrainian men and women equal legal status. That includes social insurance and access to work. So people are very well integrated, and yet public sentiment is turning. And I think it is turning because on the one hand, people's frustration and the fears that genuinely exist, the fear that Poland itself could possibly be threatened by war, are being projected onto Ukrainians themselves as though they were somehow the source of it. I think that operates more on a subconscious level. But on the other hand, nationalist forces in Poland are now also making anti-Ukrainian arguments and engaging in politics that way, if you will. There are two parties that stand out in particular. One is Konfederacja, a nationalist libertarian party that is also represented in the Sejm, the Polish parliament. In recent months, or even over the past 2 or 3 years, it has consistently polled well above what its parliamentary representation would suggest, at nearly 15%. And it argues very strongly against Ukraine, saying that Poland must put its own interests first. The politicians themselves are not arguing specifically against the refugees, at least not primarily. Instead, they frame it this way. Warsaw, or Poland as a country, has to stand up for its own interests in relation to Kyiv and the Ukrainian government. And that gains them support. Then there is a second party, also called Confederation, translated as Confederation of the Polish Crown, led by a very strident politician. He has also drawn attention in the EU because he was, or is, a member of the European Parliament and is essentially an anti-Semite. At the same time, he constantly organizes very provocative actions and also argues very strongly against Ukraine. Together, the two confederations now have roughly 20 and sometimes as much as 25% support. And now the opposition party PS, which governed until 2023 and had not used any anti-Ukrainian rhetoric up to that point, is jumping on that bandwagon as well. But it realizes that it is simply losing voters to these right-wing parties. So it too is beginning, or in fact it began some time ago, to argue in anti-Ukrainian terms. And 2 months ago, it was handed a major argument when Ukrainian President Zelensky named a military unit after the heroes of the UPA. The UPA was the Ukrainian insurgent army during World War II. And in Poland, the UPA is a red flag because it collaborated with the fascists in what is considered genocide.
We're talking about Volhynia. My friends in Warsaw tell me that people here in Poland say, "We helped the Ukrainians. They also helped us die off in 1943 and 1944 in Volhynia." What happened there?
1943 und 44 in Volhynien. Was war da los?
There was a major massacre that came to a head in the summer of 1943, but it lasted several months. As I said, this was a region that is now part of Western Ukraine. But in the pre-war period, before World War II, it was part of Eastern Poland, or part of Poland, with a mixed population, because it was a mixed region. But many Poles lived there. And during World War II, the region was of course occupied. And then there was the Ukrainian insurgent army. Its goal, or its long-term goal, was also to help ensure that the Ukrainian state could rise again after a possible end to the war. And of course, they did not want the Poles there. That was the background to this massacre, in which around 100,000 people, Polish civilians, were murdered, in some cases brutally. There were also retaliatory actions on the Polish side, in which thousands of Ukrainians died as well. These were carried out by irregular Polish units, essentially as retaliatory measures. But this is very, very deeply ingrained in Polish perceptions and in the historical consciousness of the population. So Zelensky's decision to name a current military unit After those units, those UPA units, it was really foreseeable that this would trigger a huge outcry among the Polish public, and especially within the political class, or parts of it, namely the right-wing nationalist parties. A deliberate provocation? I can certainly imagine that it was deliberate if you look at the domestic political situation in Ukraine. After all, Zelensky is constantly under pressure at home as well.
Zelensky steht ja auch innenpolitisch stets eigentlich unter Druck und ich denke, damit wusste dass da die
And I think he knew that this would allow him to rally the public behind him, or at least larger parts of the public, and perhaps also diffuse political forces, or bring them over to his side. Because the point was, okay, we decide whom we honor as heroes, and we won't let anyone tell us otherwise. That is roughly what Zelensky said a few days later at a rally. In other words, we decide whom we honor as heroes, and no one from outside will tell us otherwise. And of course, that was a clear response to the Polish perspective, which incidentally resulted in the Polish president stripping the Ukrainian president of the highest state honor, the Order of the White Eagle, which had been awarded to him 2 or 3 years earlier by the previous Polish president.
Amtsvorgänger des polnischen Präsidenten verliehen worden war. Also das sind alles die Gründe, die da eine Rolle spielen.
So those are all the reasons playing a role in why public sentiment is shifting. As I said, when it comes to the Polish population, it is more the presence of Ukrainians. There are currently around 1.6 million Ukrainians living in Poland. Of those, as I said, about 1 million are refugees, and well over 500,000 were already there before. That is what the public is more focused on. And the political forces working with this issue, or seeking to win votes ahead of the parliamentary elections next year, are focusing more on political decisions in Kyiv. But these are not explicitly related to the war with Russia. That is very important. Instead, they refer to Polish-Ukrainian disputes from the past.
Polnisch-ukrainischen Dispute eigentlich aus der Vergangenheit.
In Warsaw, a young refugee couple from Ukraine was beaten up by hooligans. An isolated incident?
Ein Einzelfall?
Ja, diese Fälle häufen sich.
Yes, these cases are becoming more frequent. There is a statistic showing that in the first half of this year, the number increased by around 30 to 40%. These are acts of violence, verbal, but also physical, directed at victims specifically because of their nationality. And that figure is credible to me, because I perceive this mood as well. You hear it in the media, but sometimes also in conversations, in the undertones. People have become more distant. Many people have become more distant toward Ukrainians in the country. So yes, we're not talking about thousands of cases. In the first half of the year, I believe there were around 180 cases. These were not always physical assaults. Most were verbal. But these cases are becoming more frequent.
Eben diese Fälle häufen sich und ja.
Ich kenne eine Grafikerin, eine Polin.
I know a graphic designer, a Polish woman who has nightmares at night. She comes from a family that experienced those massacres by the Ukrainian fascists in Volhynia firsthand. Are these traumas passed down in Polish families?
Werden in polnischen Familien diese Traumata weitergegeben?
Ja, ich denke, in diesen betroffenen Familien sicherlich schon.
Yes, I think certainly in the families affected. But I believe this problem could actually be resolved. In that sense, there had already been some rapprochement. And for example, the Polish side was not at all demanding that the Ukrainian side acknowledge it as genocide, that there should be a parliamentary resolution in Kyiv, and so on. For a long time, what the Polish side wanted was simply the possibility of exhuming the victims' remains, for example. There was some movement on the Ukrainian side, but never any real opening.
Aber immer keine wirkliche Öffnung. Und ja, ich glaube, das Problem könnte.
And yes, I think the problem might not have become this severe if both sides were not stoking the flames. But I do think that President Zelensky may have taken this step deliberately. Even though overall, of course, we also have to see this. For Ukraine, in the context of the policy it is pursuing in the war against Russia, and if the war is to continue, you need, so to speak, a a shared national foundation, and the resistance fighters, or insurgent fighters, of the UPA are part of that pantheon, even if they committed crimes, in order to mobilize those national feelings. To that extent, it is understandable.
Diese nationalen Gefühle zu mobilisieren. Insofern ist das nachvollziehbar. Ich begrüße das nicht, aber es ist nachvollziehbar und ich kann mir aber eben
I don't
vorstellen, dass
welcome
das
it,
eben eine
but it's
gezielte
understandable.
Provokation war.
And I can imagine that it was a deliberate provocation aimed at winning back support in the country and then rallying people behind them. In other words, the rally around the flag effect. Yes, this is history, or rather, it is actually historical. And as I said, there are very concrete ways to resolve this, and what the Polish side was really concerned about in the past. If the Ukrainian side were to meet these conditions, meaning allow the victims to be exhumed, then there would be less potential for right-wing political forces in Poland to seize on this issue so strongly.
In Polen dieses Thema so stark aufzugreifen.
Macht die Ukraine aber nicht, sondern
But Ukraine does not do that. What is striking in Ukraine, though, is the cult surrounding the fascist leader Bandera. And Poland's defense minister made a clear statement. With the Bandera cult in Ukraine, Ukraine will not gain entry into the European Union. Does Poland want to make Ukraine's admission conditional on that?
Will Polen die Aufnahme der Ukraine an Bedingungen knüpfen?
Ja, sagt das deswegen, weil die Stimmung der
Yes,
Bevölkerung
he says that
und sagt
because
das
he is
auch
picking
deswegen,
up
weil
on the
weiß,
mood
dass,
among the public.
womöglich
And he
die
also says it
Regierung,
because he knows that the government may then,
Minister gehört
well, it should be
eigentlich
said that the
einer
defense
Partei,
minister actually
pro-europäisch
belongs to a
ist.
party that is generally pro-European, that supports close ties with Brussels, and of course with the Americans as well, but does not try to appeal to nationalist sentiments. The fact that he says this indicates that there has been a shift in Polish public opinion and that right-wing forces are gaining support with these positions. And I do think that, well, I don't believe EU accession will fail over whether Bandera is revered or not. I don't believe that.
Ob Bandera verehrt wird oder nicht verehrt wird, das glaube ich nicht. Es ist ein rhetorisches Mittel eben
It is a rhetorical device, really, for doing domestic politics. I believe that Ukraine's accession to the EU, if I may say something about that, could very well fail for entirely different reasons. Namely, because hopefully, of course, there will soon be a ceasefire there, and perhaps even a peace treaty. But even then, in the best-case scenario, I do not see it as automatic that Ukraine would actually become part of the EU. That it will not become part of NATO is clear. We will certainly talk about that later. But even its becoming part of the EU is not a given, because it is in fact a destroyed or partially destroyed country with a traumatized population. It needs reconstruction, and hundreds of billions of euros will be needed.
Hunderte von Milliarden Euro notwendig sind und ich kann mir nicht vorstellen, dass
And I can't imagine that a number of governments, including those of EU member states, would admit this country to the EU in its current condition, because this involves very, very specific policy areas that would of course have to be resolved. For example, agricultural policy, agricultural flows, or the flow of agricultural products, and so on, and industrial policy in general. Who is supposed to pay for reconstruction? In what form? Through interest-free loans or other arrangements? So achieving unanimity in the EU on this in the future, I think that will be very, very difficult. And I don't think it will fail because of Polish resistance to Bandera. It will fail because of many, many other very concrete issues.
vielen anderen ganz handfesten Dingen.
Die Nachrichtenagentur Bloomberg beziffert
More than a year ago, Bloomberg News put the war damage and reconstruction costs at least $800 billion.
auf mindestens
And the war is not over yet. By its own account, the European Union has already invested 214 billion euros in the war in Ukraine. And calculations by German economic institutes show that based on the EU's current budget, if Ukraine were admitted, between 130 and 180 billion euros would flow to Ukraine. Poland is not a donor country within the EU. It is a recipient country receiving subsidies from Brussels. From Warsaw's perspective, that would be a reason not to admit Ukraine, wouldn't it?
Das wäre ein Motiv, die Ukraine nicht aufzunehmen aus der Perspektive von Warschau, oder?
Ja, beispielsweise. Und nicht nur aus der Perspektive von Warschau, ne? Weil es ist ja so, dass
Yes, for example. And not only from Warsaw's perspective, because whenever poorer countries join, the threshold, so to speak, shifts, or rather, the point at which a country is considered a donor country or a recipient country changes. The point at which a country actually becomes a donor country naturally shifts to Poland's disadvantage, but also to the disadvantage of all the other recipient countries that are recipient countries today. And as I said, that is only one argument. Agricultural policy also still plays a very major role for Poland. I mentioned this earlier because Ukraine can produce grain that Poland simply cannot compete with on price. That is clear. This involves very specific conditions that would have to be met. Yes, and I believe there would be resistance not only from the Polish leadership, whoever that might be, but also from other governments to Ukraine joining. But as I said, that is still up in the air. Still, as I said, it certainly would not be automatic.
Das steht ja noch in den Sternen. Nur, wie gesagt, das ist kein Selbstläufer, sicherlich. Ne?
Sicherlich kämen die Bauern in alle
Farmers in all EU countries, Poland, Germany, France, Italy, would certainly come under enormous pressure.
weil sie
They simply could not compete with Ukraine's low wages, its highly fertile black soils, the productivity of Ukrainian agriculture, and its price advantages. You mentioned that.
Preisvorteil gar nicht mithalten könnten. Sie haben es erwähnt.
Ja, also wie gesagt, die EU kann sowas ausgleichen.
Yes, as I said, the EU can offset something like that by saying, for example, that there will be no subsidies for farmers. That is, by the way, what it did with Poland as well. In other words, Polish farmers and other farmers in Central and Eastern Europe did not receive the same subsidies as German farmers starting in 2004. That was an attempt to balance things out. The same could be done with Ukraine. But overall, it's simply even after a ceasefire, I can hardly imagine a peace agreement that would immediately, or within a relatively short period of time, bring real stability.
Auch wirkliche Stabilität bedeuten wird. Also auch das positivste
So,
Szenario.
even the most positive scenario, which is very unlikely today, where an actual peace settlement, or at least a cold peace, can be achieved, will not make Ukraine a stable country. It will remain a destabilized country, where there will probably also be a change in government, because I don't think President Zelensky will be re-elected politically, or will have a political future after that. I think there will be a great deal of dissatisfaction in Ukraine as well. So there will be major turmoil within Ukraine. And that alone, I think, will be an argument for many European governments to say, hold on, we need to slow down a bit when it comes to EU accession.
Wir müssen da mal ein bisschen langsam machen mit dem EU-Beitritt.
Es gibt in der Sozialwissenschaft den Begriff der Co-Transformation.
In social science, there is a term called co-transformation. When one country changes, its neighboring countries change as well.
Würde ein Beitritt
Would Ukraine joining the EU lead less to Ukraine becoming more like European countries and more to European countries becoming more like Ukraine? In other words, would crime and corruption spill over?
der Ukraine
We had the attack in Monaco, for example.
von Kriminalität und Korruption. Wir hatten den Anschlag in Monaco beispielsweise.
Ja, das würde ich so.
Yes, I might not put it quite that way. I think that in Ukraine, the essential, the fundamental question is, what happens next with the war? At this point, there is still no prospect that it could end soon, although of course, things could develop differently. And I hope they do develop differently, so that people there stop dying on both sides. And I think that is, first of all, the fundamental, the absolutely fundamental question. Because in that sense, we are shaped by what is happening in Ukraine as a result of the Russian attack, or the war started by Russia. That has already significantly changed the policies of our countries.
Die Politik unserer Staaten natürlich maßgeblich verändert schon. Insofern stimme ich Ihnen dazu. Also sozusagen, wir transformieren uns schon.
To that extent, I agree. We are already being transformed, so to speak, but not through Ukraine joining the EU. Rather, through the war, in which we are involved in certain ways, through arms deliveries, the provision of intelligence, other support, financial assistance, and so on. In that sense, Ukraine, or this war, is already changing Europe. It is changing Europe, and not for the better. And I think we agree that it is not doing so in a positive way. How things might develop after a possible peace agreement is anyone's guess. As I said, I find it hard to imagine one at the moment, even though it would, of course, have to be pursued.
I'd like to come back to that a little later. First, I'm interested in this. What conditions would the government in Warsaw set for Ukraine to join the EU? What requirements would have to be met?
Yes, it would certainly affect what I mentioned, agricultural policy, in the sense that the Polish market would be protected. Overall, it has to be said that for nearly 30 or 35 years now, ever since the country was no longer part of the Eastern Bloc, or since the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire, collapsed, an informal doctrine has been in place in Poland. It is the Giedroyc doctrine. It goes back to two Polish intellectuals who said that Poland's sovereignty depends on whether our neighboring states, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, meaning our immediate neighbors, are sovereign. So if they are no longer part of the Soviet Empire, that is our security guarantee, so that we are not crushed again, as we were in World War II, neither from the West, nor, in this case, of course, from the East.
In diesem Fall vom Osten natürlich. Und auf Basis dieser Doktrin
And on the basis of this doctrine, a view has also taken hold across party lines, or at least among the most important parties, PiS, and the now governing civic platform of Prime Minister Tusk, that Ukraine, a Ukraine that is sovereign and also part of the EU, serves Poland's interests. And the current government is acting on that basis as well, at least. The current government of Prime Minister Tusk, who, as you know, is also very well connected in Europe. You could say he is right in the middle of the EU mainstream. He was also chairman of the European People's Party and served as president of the European Council for 5 years. So, under his leadership, one would probably expect the conditions for Ukraine's accession, if that were to be discussed, to be set somewhat lower. And if conservative or nationalist forces were to come to power, the bar for accession would be set very high, with issues such as coming to terms with history playing a major role. But as I said, there are of course many areas that would have to be negotiated, and many conditions that Ukraine would have to meet institutionally in order to fulfill the requirements for joining the EU. But as I said, I think that is still a very, very long way off.
Russian President Putin justified the Russian invasion by saying that the West was trying to bring Ukraine into NATO. He also points to the coup on the Maidan in February 2014 and describes that as the actual beginning of the conflict, because it led to the civil war against the population in Donbass by the Ukrainian army in the so-called anti-terrorist operation. Poland also supported the coup on the Maidan at the time. I'm basing this on the research findings of Ivan Kachanovsky at the University of Ottawa. How?
Den Putsch auf dem Maidan unterstützt. Wie?
Ja, also wie gesagt,
Yes, as I said, this was supported because Ukraine, the Ukrainian leadership at the time, the trigger, after all, was that President Yanukovych at least temporarily broke off the negotiations with the EU, which people in Poland and other countries had already considered a done deal. And then suddenly, there was a stop sign. In the mainstream, that was interpreted as Ukraine withdrawing eastward again, or drifting eastward again. And in the context of what I told you before, Poland has an interest in Ukraine being a sovereign state that naturally also moves closer to the Western camp, which Poland itself belongs to. There was corresponding political support. That was also why Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski became part of the negotiating troika, together with the German Foreign Minister and the French Foreign Minister. So he played a relatively prominent role as well. I think that was also because, from the Western side, they wanted to make use, in a certain sense, of the ties that existed between Ukraine and Poland. There is also a very famous video still online, in which Radosław Sikorski addresses these far-right forces, who rejected the compromise that was on the table at the time and was later, of course, thrown out.
It was negotiated, among others, with Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who was Germany's foreign minister at the time. But the radical forces on the Maidan did not abide by it. Yes, but of course then that...
Naturally, this is not presented that way by the Polish side, or in the Polish mainstream, or by major political forces. In Poland, of course, it is not regarded as a coup. That is very clear. Just as in the German mainstream, it is not regarded as a coup either, but as a freedom movement. Exactly. And sometimes, of course, there is no examination of how this protest actually came about, how these shootings came about, and so on. There are different investigations and different interpretations. In Poland, the perspective is, and this may be important to mention here, there is a very strong anti-Russian reflex, and also a complex around it. The two go together, and both are understandable to me. I was born in Poland and spent 10 years of my life there. Then I lived in Germany for 23 years, and now I've been living in Poland again for 15 years. So I have something of an outside perspective from Germany, because I lived here for a long time, but by now I also have the Polish perspective. And for me, it's understandable. This anti-Russian complex and these fears, some of which become irrational. We may come back to that. They simply exist. People are almost blindly prepared to support anything directed against the Russians or against Russia without considering whether it is actually in our own interest. And what happened in Kyiv in 2013 and 2014 was then presented accordingly, as you said, as a freedom movement, so to speak. Ukraine's desire for freedom prevailed over the authoritarianism of those oriented toward Russia, and it prevailed over Putin. That is how it is interpreted. And interestingly enough, perspectives put forward even by American geostrategists, or by Henry Kissinger, for example, are dismissed as well. In 2015, Kissinger spoke quite explicitly about Ukraine. He said Ukraine is not a country like any other, and that it should really seek neutral status, because otherwise it would be torn apart. Henry Kissinger, who is held in the highest regard in Poland, is then torn apart on this specific issue, simply because he takes a different perspective, one that does not align at all with the Polish view, which assumes that Russia is, and always will remain imperial in its ambitions. And as soon as it has consolidated and amassed the forces to do so, sooner or later it will move further on, beyond Ukraine, and at some point into Poland as well. That is something deeply ingrained in people's minds. But it is also, and perhaps even more importantly, reinforced by the media. Naturally, it is reinforced by the relevant think tanks, and it is overlaid by what, at least until the start of the war, was prevalent or perceptible in Poland. I would almost describe it as a kind of U.S. religion. The idea that the United States is the state you absolutely have to hold on to, no matter what it does, because it is our security guarantor against a possible invasion from the East in the future. So this is the context you have to see behind every political move by Poland, whether it is merely hinted at or actually carried out. This anti-Russian complex and reflex is very, very strong. It is really 3, 4, 5 times stronger than it is among at least parts of the German population, because that is understandable historically. Russia was one of the powers that partitioned Poland from the partitions of Poland in the 18th century into the 20th century. And above all, during World War II, 2 weeks after Hitler's armies invaded, Stalin's armies also marched into eastern Poland and occupied virtually half the country. So all of that is understandable. But whether something is understandable is a different question from whether it is rationally correct. And in my view, the policy pursued by the Polish government is, of course, not correct.
Für diese polnischen Ängste, die weit verbreitet sind, gibt es
There are good historical reasons for these Polish fears, which are widespread, and they also became evident on the Maidan. So I'd like to come back to that. How far did Polish support go? Were there Polish demonstrators? Was there direct assistance? Kaczynowski's books, as well as other eyewitness accounts, report that Polish diplomats allegedly handed money to the organizers of the Maidan, and one witness statement is cited saying that there were also Polish snipers on the Maidan. Would you say there is anything to that?
Auf dem Maidan gewesen. Würden Sie sagen, ist da was dran?
Da kann ich Ihnen dazu wenig sagen.
I can't tell you much about that. I analyzed this aspect at the time, but I can no longer recall it well enough to tell you in detail what the Polish support looked like. There was certainly support at the unofficial level, because there was, of course, support at the official level as well. As I mentioned, the Polish foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, who is once again foreign minister today. But regarding these events, for example, Polish snipers, I can't give you any details.
Da kann ich Ihnen keine Details nennen.
Mit Blick auf das aktuelle Geschehen.
Looking at current events, military experts say that 1/3 of the weapons delivered to Ukraine, as well as large portions of the financial aid, are disappearing through shady channels. Is this being reported in Poland? Are Polish actors involved as well?
Sind da auch polnische Akteure beteiligt?
Ja, es wird in den Mainstream Medien
Yes, there's less reporting about it in the mainstream media, if it's mentioned at all, than only in passing. But of course it becomes a topic on social media, in groups like that, or among people who already have anti-Ukrainian views anyway. And of course then, well, for someone who deals with politics, and also with the arms industry, and this whole complex, it's clear that with financial flows like these, happening over such short periods of time and on such a large scale, there are naturally going to be irregularities.
In so einer Höhe, dass es da natürlich zu Unregelmäßigkeiten kommt. Und beispielsweise wurde jetzt auch in einigen
And for example, some government-aligned texts in Polish media have now also addressed the fact that the replacement of Ukraine's defense minister, Reznikov, his dismissal by Zelensky, is of course partly connected to the fact that different factions among arms suppliers and weapons manufacturers within Ukraine itself are fighting each other. This is not about Polish deliveries or Polish support. The now former defense minister, Reznikov, wanted to bring about more transparency there. And I believe that people in Poland who look into this more closely are certainly aware of that.
Menschen, die sich damit beschäftigen, etwas intensiver durchaus bewusst, aber es ist kein
But it is not yet a political issue. The Polish government, to make that clear for viewers, is much closer to the Ukrainian leadership, or has much better relations with the Ukrainian leadership than the Polish president. The president also plays a major role in Poland. He has veto power, for example. He can block laws, and yes, he also argues this way, or tries to gain some political capital, at least in part, from anti-Ukrainian attitudes. But as I said, the fact that irregularities are occurring, there is not being widely discussed explicitly in the mainstream media.
In den Mainstream-Medien wird das nicht breit thematisiert.
Gibt es konkrete Hinweise?
Are there concrete indications in Poland, in the Polish press, among Polish investigative journalists or bloggers, of kickbacks, bonus payments, or bribes flowing back into the EU, for example, through the Baltic states, Poland, Germany, and Luxembourg?
That may be the case in niche media, but no, I'm not aware of it.
Sie haben vorhin auch die blutige Geschichte zwischen
Earlier, you also mentioned the bloody history between Poland and Russia. One part of it was the Polish Bolshevik War after World War I in 1919 and 1920. The Red Army lost that war, and Poland's leader at the time, Piłsudski, won it. How does that still affect things today? These were wars marked by enormous massacres as well, if you read the diaries of military correspondents from that time, such as Bulgakov or Isaac Babel.
Ja, da gibt es mindestens drei Aspekte, die irgendwo eine Rolle
Yes,
noch
there are
spielen.
at least
Also
three
das eine,
aspects that
dass
still play a role today, in one way or another.
was sozusagen
One
die
concerns the traditionalist religious side of my fellow countrymen. The Battle of Warsaw took place, which in Poland is regarded as the miracle of Warsaw. At the time, people had assumed that the Russians, that is, the Soviet army, would actually advance as far as Warsaw and win the war. Then the Battle of Warsaw took place. It marked the turning point. Polish troops then advanced as far as Kyiv before being pushed back, and a border was eventually agreed upon. That is one aspect, the miracle on the Vistula. It matters in the sense that even today, for example, the Polish president says, look, we can learn from history. The Russians are not invincible.
Wir können aus der Geschichte lernen, die Russen sind nicht unbesiegbar. Das wird allen Ernstes vom
The Polish president is seriously taking that as, so to speak, a call to fight. So it does play a role. What also plays a role in Polish-Ukrainian relations when it comes to this war is that Ukrainian units fought alongside Poland, with the promise that if Poland won, Poland would support the independence of certain parts of Ukraine. That did not happen, and in Ukraine, it is still seen today as a betrayal by Poland. That, of course, also plays a role. Ukrainian-Polish relations also played a role, yes, or are important to understanding the history leading up to what happened in Volhynia.
Für die Vorgeschichte dessen, was in Volhynien passiert ist. Aber das würde vielleicht jetzt an dieser Stelle zu weit führen.
But that may be going too far at this point. Still, in Ukraine, it has not been forgotten to this day, at least not by parts of the population, that the Polish side said, fight with us, and we promise you it will happen, and we will support your independence. But that did not come to pass. And perhaps that is a third aspect. For the Polish side, it was also evidence, further evidence, that Poland's position, including its geographic position, is important. In other words, the nationalist camp says, in this war, we basically saved Europe from Bolshevism. That is also part of the narrative surrounding the Polish-Soviet War of 1920.
Teil der Erzählung von diesem polnisch-sowjetischen Krieg 1920 ist.
Und genau das war ja auch beabsichtigt.
And that was precisely the intention behind the re-establishment of Poland through the Treaty of Versailles. The first German envoy in Warsaw, Harry Count Kessler, writes in his memoirs that after Germany's defeat in the First World War, Germany also provided Poland with weapons. Meanwhile, from the Soviet side, the Red Marshal Tukhachevsky was marching on Warsaw, while Stalin was directing the Southern Army toward Lemberg. This created a gap through which Piłsudski was able to break through and essentially save Warsaw. The result was also the idea of a Greater Poland. Parts of Western Ukraine subsequently belonged to Poland, as you mentioned. Yes.
Gehörten im Anschluss, Sie haben es erwähnt, zu Polen.
Ja. Beispielsweise Lemberg.
For example, Lviv, the most important major city that belonged to Poland at the time.
Und heute sagt man noch in Polen, das Grab.
And even today, people still say this in Poland. Marshal Piłsudski's grave is in Vilnius, and there is always a flame burning at that grave. I've seen it myself. So does the dream of a Greater Poland from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea still exist, or is it still there beneath the surface?
Bis zum Schwarzen Meer immer noch da oder unterschwellig da?
Ich glaube, wenn dann nur unterschwellig. Also das ist bestimmt, gibt's bestimmt.
I think, if anything, only beneath the surface. There are certainly nationalist forces that have something like that in mind, but it isn't a serious position that needs to be debated now. There are no political forces thinking in that direction in any way. Of course, strategically minded politicians recognize that Poland holds an important role or an important position in this region. It is the largest country alongside Ukraine.
In dieser Region. Es ist das größte Land natürlich neben der Ukraine. Die Ukraine hatte ja etwa knapp 50 Millionen Einwohner.
Ukraine used to have just under 50 million people. Of course, that number is now significantly lower. Poland has 37-38 million people. But it is, of course, much stronger economically. So the idea is that Poland could and should have a certain leadership role in the region, together with the Baltic states, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and so on, in a broader alliance with Poland as the most important country. But great power ambitions in the sense of somehow contemplating border changes. Of course, there is nothing like that.
Grenzverschiebung denkt, dass sowas gibt es natürlich nicht.
Der russische Präsident Putin hat
Russian President Putin once said, in an offhand remark that he repeated again recently, well, in the end, Ukraine will be divided up, and the Poles will take Western Ukraine back for themselves.
die Westukraine holen.
Ja, aber das ist Quatsch.
Yes, but that's nonsense. As I said, this isn't political material that requires a lot of engagement. There are no forces behind it. Of course, it was a provocation, sure, but it also, I don't think he has achieved much now, either in Ukraine or in Poland.
Weder in der Ukraine noch in Polen.
Es gibt noch mehr Hühnchen, die man aus der polnischen Perspektive.
There are still more scores to settle with Russia from the Polish perspective. There's a film by Andrzej Wajda, released in 1957, called Kanal. It's about the uprising of the Polish Home Army, the Second Warsaw Uprising in 1944. The Home Army fighters gathered, in part, in the sewer canals to organize the resistance. And the film ends with the last scattered remnants of the Home Army trying to flee to the Vistula. But there is a grate in front of the tunnel, and the camera pans away over the Vistula. And unlike in Germany, every Pole knows what that means. On the other side, the Red Army waited until the Nazis had finished off our resistance fighters. What role does that still play today?
Unseren Widerstandskämpfern fertig war. Welche Rolle spielt das bis heute?
Auch dieser Warschauer Aufstand spielt eine sehr bedeutende Rolle.
Oh, the Warsaw Uprising plays a very significant role. You can see that in every museum in Warsaw. Exactly, in public perception, in society's perception. It is also commemorated every year, for example, on August 1st. At 5 p.m., sirens sound across the entire country. Many cars stop, and people remember. So over the past 20-25 years, this has also been deliberately embedded in public memory and supported by politicians. What is important is the context. The uprising broke out because the goal was to drive out the Germans, but at the same time to show the Soviets, we are sovereign.
Den Sowjets zu zeigen, wir sind souverän. Das war so quasi ein doppeltes.
So there were, in a sense, two goals they wanted to achieve. Ultimately, of course, they hoped the Soviets would intervene, but also accept us as an autonomous force. And that is exactly what Stalin did not want. He did not want that. And in fact, he let the Polish forces there bleed out. And that is, of course, a tragic story. From my perspective, the uprising itself was a wrong decision. And that is not the view held by the majority in Poland, but by a minority who say 200,000 people died, including many women, many young people, and civilians.
Viele Frauen, viele Jugendliche und Zivilisten. Die Stadt wurde dem Erdboden gleichgemacht. Und wofür war
The city was razed to the ground. And what was it all for, really? I do align myself with that camp because I think human lives still take precedence over sovereignty, autonomy, rightly or wrongly understood, or whatever else. And I believe the people there were sacrificed. But in the Polish perception, the Warsaw Uprising plays a very, very important role. Today it is seen as a heroic uprising, but also, of course, a tragic one.
Ein heldenhafter Aufstand, aber auch ein tragischer Aufstand natürlich gewertet.
Und das spielt bis heute eine Rolle im Verhältnis zur Sowjetunion.
And that still plays a role today in relations with the Soviet Union, and of course with Russia as well. In his book about the Second Warsaw Uprising, Rising 44, the British historian Norman Davies writes about the uprising's long-term consequences. In 1956, there was an uprising in Hungary. Soviet tanks rolled in there, but the Soviet Union did not invade Poland. And Norman Davies writes that Gomułka, the state and party leader at the time, anything but a Democrat, mobilized the Polish army to oppose an invasion by the Red Army. And Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, backed down because he remembered the heroic struggle of the Poles in the sewers in 1944. Is there anything to that? Is he right?
1944. Ist da was dran? Liegt er richtig?
Also diese Information, dass die polnische Armee.
So I have to say, this information that the Polish army was mobilized by Gomułka against the Russian army at that time is new to me. But what is not new to me, or what I can understand, is that the Poles may actually have deterred the Soviets from invading Poland in the same way they did in Hungary, and later in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. Because I think it was certainly known the fighting spirit, and the attitude of the people in Poland. Based on their history, there had already been uprisings in the 19th century, for example, which were suppressed by the Tsarist Empire in parts of Polish territory, and so on. So it was also part of Soviet historical experience that the Poles are very combative, and in that respect, I can understand why the tanks did not roll in. The same, by the way, in 1981, when martial law was declared.
And the Solidarity trade union was initially banned.
Exactly. But before that, it was tolerated for 16 months, it has to be said. And anyone who remembers the images from back then, or who has looked into the subject, knows that this was, of course, a freedom movement. Suddenly, freedom of expression was de facto allowed. And in the Eastern Bloc at that time, that was unprecedented. And yet, the Soviets let it continue for 16 months before increasing the pressure to the point where the Polish leadership itself imposed martial law. And I think the Soviets may also have considered helping to crush it or even invading. But they must have thought, if we do that, the revolt will really break out. So yes, that would confirm what you're saying.
Das würde das bestätigen, was Sie sagen.
Bis heute gibt es ja eine Diskussion, nicht nur unter Historikern, die Rolle des damaligen Staats- und Parteichefs Jaruzelski. Die einen sagen, Jaruzelski hat das Kriegsrecht durchgesetzt,
He pushed it through to avoid a Soviet invasion, and the others say he did it in the service of the Soviets, that old hardliner. Where do you stand on that?
Wo stehen Sie da?
Ja, wissen Sie, ich bin gespalten, weil ich glaube, hat das
Yes, I'm torn on this, because I think he did it for that reason, because there were many things interacting. It wasn't just pressure from the Soviets. 16 months after Solidarity had emerged and then been allowed to operate, officially registered as a trade union, it had become a huge movement with 10 million members. Over time, it became, so to speak, destabilizing for the political leadership. And incidentally, the economic situation in the country had not improved either. If anything, it had gotten worse.
Hat sich nicht verbessert, sondern fast eher verschlechtert. Und die ökonomische Situation war übrigens einer der Gründe auch, warum die Solidarność.
And the economic situation, by the way, was also one of the reasons Solidarność came into being in the first place, along with strikes related to layoffs and so on. So I think there were plenty of arguments in favor of Jaruzelski doing what he did. Of course, I don't think it was right, because people were killed. Especially in the area where I live, there was a major shock, the takeover of a mine, where miners had refused, so to speak, to follow the new line. Then almost a dozen miners were shot in what was truly a brutal and unnecessary operation. So it's difficult for me to feel any sympathy for Jaruzelski.
Fällt es mir da schwer, irgendwelche Sympathien für Jaruzelski zu entwickeln. Ich kann politisch das aber nachvollziehen, dass es geschehen ist.
Politically, I can understand why it happened. In the long run, it couldn't have worked for one state, within that huge Eastern Bloc, that still presented itself as homogeneous, the so-called real socialist states at the time, to allow rights in that way, without it eventually, so to speak, spilling over into other countries. And of course, the leadership in Moscow could not allow a trade union and a movement to be active there that called all of this into question, or at least called large parts of the communist leadership, its narrative, and so on, into question. They could not put up with that forever. So it is understandable, without my endorsing it.
Also es ist nachvollziehbar, ohne dass ich das begrüße. Ja, und
what role did the Catholic Church and the Vatican play during the period when Solidarity was banned and was essentially continuing to exist underground?
Ja, die katholische Kirche spielte sowieso in Polen die ganze Zeit eine.
The Catholic Church played a very major role in Poland throughout that time. I would say that for one thing, it served as a kind of gathering point, a meeting place, for all sorts of opposition forces. One of the most important opposition figures, Adam Michnik, had already drawn attention in the 1960s when he was 18 or 20 as someone opposed to the communist forces. He later became one of the leading opposition figures and is now, incidentally, the editor of one of the country's most important daily newspapers. In the 1970s, he wrote a book called Church, Left, Dialogue. The idea was to bring together the opposition forces that existed in Poland, forces that did not necessarily have anything to do with the church, that were secular, and that sometimes organized their resistance from a left-wing perspective, with the church-related forces and with intellectually traditionalist forces.
Kirchennahen Kräften zusammenzubringen. Also sozusagen die laizistische Linke und die
So bringing together the secular left and the traditionally church-oriented intellectuals and forming an opposition together. And in the end, that did succeed, you could say. And the church played, yes, I would say it played more of a background role as moral support for the resistance, or for saying no. Of course, the election of the Polish Pope also played a role. It gave people inner strength. That was, of course, not in the interests of the communist regime. So the church did play its part. And in some respects, that can certainly be viewed very positively when it comes to the period up to 1989.
Were financial resources also funneled through the Vatican, printing presses and similar things? Yes, of course.
That played a role as well. As I said, I don't have any specific figures on the quantities involved, but of course it played a role.
We talked about the fears many people in Poland have, including in Polish politics, with regard to the Soviet Union in the past and Russia today. What about Germany? After World War II, Warsaw was a sea of skeletal ruins, with flames singing through them. When statements are made now, such as Chancellor Friedrich Merz saying, "We want to become the strongest conventional military power in Europe again," what feelings does that stir in Warsaw?
Welche Gefühle löst das in Warschau aus?
That triggers different feelings depending on whom you ask. Of course, there is the political level among political actors, and then there is the public. For those who view it less critically, the context is that they say, sure, they want to rearm, but they are not rearming against us. They are rearming against Russia. So that is the context we have to consider. Among nationalist forces, it is naturally viewed with a certain degree of suspicion. But at the same time, there is also an awareness that Poland is increasing its armed forces as well, and of the imbalance when it comes to what people abroad now think of the Bundeswehr, in the sense of how ready it is to fight, and whether in its current state it is feared or not. That also plays a role. We are not in the 1930s, when, at least in hindsight, we know that the superiority of the German armies built up toward the end of that decade over the Polish forces in terms of equipment, but also strategic measures, was, so to speak, like two different worlds. And today, even critics of this line of argument are aware that what is emerging now is not an army that will be significantly inferior to ours. That is the point. But the more important point is really this. Okay, we are already on the same side, and they are not rearming against us. You're now raising the question of rearmament, or rather, of the Germans. In Poland, there is generally broad support for it, and that support is actually quite nuanced. But there is support for the country to rearm massively, and for the army to be expanded, ultimately to 300,000 personnel. That will be, and already is, relatively difficult to achieve, as reality shows. But overall, there is fairly broad acceptance of this rearmament policy, and that is connected to fears, not of the Germans rearming, but of Russia, as I mentioned earlier. These fears are in fact so strong that sometimes, even in my view, very irrational things are simply waved through. People say, yes, okay, but it's the Russians. For example, this applies to specific arms purchases. Equipment is being bought that, even if you assume the unlikely scenario of some kind of military confrontation between Poland and Russia, the fighting in Ukraine shows is already outdated. And Poland is ordering this equipment in huge quantities and paying billions for it, money that flows abroad.
Das wurde über die ersten 3 Jahre eigentlich überhaupt nicht in Frage gestellt.
For the first 3 years, that really wasn't questioned at all. In the meantime, critical voices have been growing, but there is still broad support for it. And to that extent, part of the population understands that Germans have similar fears, and they are now less afraid that Germany will build up a large conventional army. But as I said, among nationalist forces, or among people who in some way still carry the Second World War with them, it probably sets off some alarm bells, at least smaller ones. Am I understanding you correctly?
Verstehe ich Sie richtig? Der Überfall, der
The Nazi German army's invasion in September 1939 and the complete destruction of Warsaw in 1944 did not trigger in Poland the same long-term underlying fears that exist toward the Soviet Union and Russia.
ausgelöst, die es gibt gegenüber der Sowjetunion und Russland.
Es ist so, dass man
The fears of Germany are no longer there, simply because of how history has developed over the past 35 years. Poland was able to leave the Soviet-dominated Eastern Bloc without bloodshed, which is very important, and move closer to the West. Germany also played an important role in that. Before the 2004 enlargement, Germany was the strongest supporter of enlargement within the old EU, and of course it benefited from it the most. But it was genuinely an advocate as well. Berlin advocated for Poland's accession. Overall, Poland's accession is seen as a success by the majority of the population.
von der Mehrheit der Bevölkerung als Erfolg gesehen. Also die 22 Jahre in der Mitgliedschaft in der Europäischen Union.
So overall, the 22 years of membership in the European Union are seen as a success. The country has developed economically, even though there are still major differences between rich and poor, and many, many problems that still need to be solved. But joining the EU, which is also credited to Germany, in a sense, in its role as an advocate, is viewed as a success. And in that respect, there are no longer fears that the Germans could now do exactly the same thing again. I think those fears exist only among a small minority. What larger parts of the population hold against the Germans is, for example, the way the issue of reparations was handled, or rather not handled, and we are talking about considerable sums.
Und da kommen wir auf beträchtliche Summen.
Da kommt man auf beträchtliche Summen, aber wie gesagt, also da hätte
That adds up to considerable sums. But as I said, Germany could have pursued a sensible policy there, if it had, so to speak, placed a somewhat higher value on its relationship with Poland, if it valued that relationship more highly. But that may be another issue. I believe that the majority of the Polish population definitely does not fear that Germany will somehow invade Poland anytime in the foreseeable future. Rather, what matters, also in the context of the Warsaw Uprising, is the memory of it and the expectation of some form of reparations. P.S. The previous National Conservative government commissioned a corresponding analysis, which was published in 2022.
Veröffentlicht wurde und da wurden die
And the property damage, or the total damage overall, including personal injury, was estimated at the equivalent of 1.3 trillion euros. That's a realistic figure. I would say I looked at the analysis and it's not unrealistic when you consider the actual damage. And of course, the German side argued that the matter had been legally settled back in the 1950s or 1960s. But the way this was handled, the way it was, so to speak, dismissed, including by the German side, that was not good. And really, some kind of gesture, it doesn't necessarily have to be a financial gesture, but a more accommodating policy from Germany would certainly have been appropriate simply to ease the atmosphere in Poland.
Earlier, you mentioned the admiration for the United States in Poland. How deeply do transatlantic and NATO networks extend into the Polish elite?
Ich denke, sie reichen sehr weit hinein.
I think they go very deep. One of Poland's largest private TV networks has an American owner, still does. Now it is up for sale, which may symbolically show that. Or let me describe a situation to you. I already mentioned our foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski. Incidentally, he was defense minister under PS in the 2000s, and now he has become foreign minister for the second time. He was also foreign minister in the 2010s. He is married to an American woman, Anne Applebaum. Yes, a relatively well-known columnist, historian, and so on, who also writes about Russian history and speaks out very explicitly on political issues.
Und Radosław
Sikorski, and she have a son who serves in the U.S. Army. That means we have a Polish foreign minister with a son serving in the U.S. Army. And Radosław Sikorski also wanted to become president in the last presidential election, but he failed internally within his party against the other candidate. Yet it played absolutely no role that a potential future Polish president had a son in the U.S. Army. I'm pointing this out to show you how strongly it is perceived, or at least was perceived, that there is practically a symbiosis of interests, almost, between Poland and the United States. There is also a motif in Poland that is used again and again.
Ein Motiv, was immer wieder verwendet wird. Es wurde, glaube ich, von tatsächlich Adam Michnik, den ich vorher erwähnt habe, geprägt.
I believe it was actually coined by Adam Michnik, whom I mentioned earlier. It describes more or less the key objectives or compass points of Polish foreign policy over the past 30 years. Michnik says, "We need the European Union for our economic development and stability, and we need the United States for our security." That perspective is now slowly beginning to break apart, of course, following Trump's return to office and because of his policies. But it is still very, very, very deeply entrenched. You can see it, for example, in the fact that the previous government bought military equipment in large quantities, mainly from the United States. And I think the networks you mentioned play an absolutely crucial role in that.
Von denen Sie sprechen, eine ganz entscheidende Rolle.
Ein Beispiel dafür ist der polnische
One example of this is the leading Polish politician Sikorski, whom you mentioned. He is married to Anne Applebaum, an American journalist and historian, who in turn is a close friend of Victoria Nuland, who helped organize the coup on the Maidan in 2014. And Victoria Nuland, in turn, is married to the neoconservative thinker Robert Kagan. And they are all connected again through the Brookings Institution and the National Endowment for Democracy. Basically, this is a transatlantic, well, one has to say it, a clique.
Ja, man muss fast sagen, Clique.
Ja, Sikorski hatte auch in Anfang der 2000er Jahre in einem
Yes, Sikorski also worked at a U.S. think tank in the early 2000s. He held a position there. He is very, very well connected in transatlantic circles and plays a very important role there. He is now also being discussed as a possible successor to Prime Minister Tusk. As I mentioned, he sought his party's presidential nomination. He lost within the party, but his political ambitions are very great.
So, the transatlantic alliance is a matter of national interest in Poland. Yes, you could put it that way.
Allerdings ist das natürlich, erhält sie jetzt Risse.
But it is now beginning to crack. Because what I described earlier, what was, so to speak, passed down to people, was this. The Americans are the ultimate model. To put it somewhat bluntly, we really only need to look to them in terms of their culture, economy, and politics. I'm deliberately overstating it. That narrative is now starting to crack, of course. Are we really safe under the American security umbrella if the administration changes and suddenly there are signals saying, maybe we're not that safe after all? And now suddenly, our most important ally is negotiating with our greatest enemy, namely Putin. So naturally, that also contributes to the sense of uncertainty among the public.
Die Verunsicherung da ist. Und die politischen Eliten sich da schon auch,
and the political elites are also trying to realign themselves. And I think the Polish government under Prime Minister Tusk is now, rather discreetly, but with real determination, trying to place more focus on Brussels. It can't emphasize that too explicitly, because the opposition would argue that security is being neglected if the government focuses only on Brussels. But I think that is more the position of the current government. Otherwise, yes, this dependence on the US, we have to say it, is very great. But the affinity is also very strong, though it is now beginning to show cracks.
Die Affinität ist sehr groß, die jetzt aber Risse bekommt.
1999 wurde Polen
In 1999, Poland was admitted to NATO, but Washington set one condition: the rehabilitation of the important Cold War spy I mentioned at the beginning, Colonel Richard Kuklinski. By then, he was living in the United States, and in Poland he had been sentenced to death by the communist government at the time. So the Polish opposition politician Leszek Miller, leader of the Social Democratic Forces, flew to Washington to make sure that the Polish opposition also supported NATO. And he met Kuklinski in a CIA safe house, spoke with him for many hours, and then had to declare that he would take care of it. So that is a legal route. Yes, that says exactly. That confirms what I said, namely, that one is acting on the basis of the prescribed.
Von Kuklinski gefunden werde, was auch geschah. Es wurde eine Ausnahmeregelung geschaffen. Was sagt das über das polnisch-amerikanische Verhältnis?
Ja, das sagt genau, das bestätigt das, was ich gesagt habe, ne? Also, dass man von der verordneten Zugehörigkeit zum Sowjetblock.
Its membership in the Soviet bloc meant it did not take on a mediating role, which it could have taken on. But that remains an open question. Still, there is this orientation toward the United States and NATO as the security anchor against possible future aggression. That is how it is viewed. And the discussion was this: was Kuklinski a traitor to his country? Because even if we had a socialist system, it was still our country, and we had a quarter of our sovereignty. It was an independent country, de facto Poland. It was not a Soviet republic. It was an independent country.
Es war keine Sowjetrepublik, es war ein eigenständiges Land, insofern hatte es gewisse Souveränität und jetzt ist
To that extent, it had a certain degree of sovereignty. And now the question is this: was he really a traitor, even if he betrayed a country whose leadership was considered illegitimate by most people at the time, and by people today as well? Was he still a traitor because he harmed our country? But that view has given way to the perspective that he was, in fact, acting with good intentions, namely, helping our supposed and now current friend free us from the Soviet Empire. So yes, that perspective dominates today.
Insofern, ja, diese Perspektive dominiert heute.
Ist
Is the government in Warsaw a conduit for Washington within the EU?
in die EU hinein.
Ja, ich würde sagen schon. In Teilen ist es das schon.
Yes, I would say so. In some respects, it is. I'm also very saddened that this is the case. Perhaps we should mention at this point that the European Union's main problem, if we look at this in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, is that fundamentally, we are not pursuing policies in Europe's interests. And I'm speaking here about the EU as such, and about the majority of EU countries. That means we are pursuing a policy. We have allowed ourselves to be divided by the Americans' policy, who were determined to bring Ukraine into NATO.
Die Ukraine in die NATO reinführen wollten. Die Deutschen und die Franzosen haben damals noch 2008 den richtigen.
Back in 2008, the Germans and the French still showed the right instinct, or intuition, however you want to put it, and said, we really shouldn't do this. But then they ultimately gave in. And just to say this up front, Europe is not acting in its own interest when it comes to its policy toward Russia and Ukraine, because it was in our interest to preserve a neutral Ukraine as it was, while at the same time seeking economic ties, possibly through association agreements. Of course, Russia would then also have had to be included, but that was not in the Americans' interest, allowing our Eurasian continent to become more deeply integrated in any peaceful way, because that would naturally weaken the Americans' position.
Weil das natürlich die Position der Amerikaner schwächen würde. Und insofern, um auf Ihre Frage zurückzukommen, natürlich brauchen die Amerikaner entsprechende Hebel.
To come back to your question, of course the Americans need appropriate leverage to counter this possible rapprochement, this Eurasian policy of rapprochement, if you want to call it that, to undermine it. And Poland is well suited for that, not only because of its geographic location, but also because of its relative size, with 38 million inhabitants, and above all, because of its history, as a victim of both the German Nazis and the Soviet Union. And of course, the relevant actors, whether intelligence services or political forces, know how Polish society is structured and which patterns of thinking work, which can then be used in this context. And, you could see in many, many instances just how easily the country can be used.
Wie das Land benutzt werden kann. Und ich kann mich erinnern jetzt auf eine ganz konkrete Szene, die das vielleicht illustriert.
I can remember one very specific scene that perhaps illustrates this. A year after the war began in Ukraine, the American president came to Poland to give a major speech, essentially to encourage people and urge them to keep fighting, and so on. He did it in Warsaw, at a prominent location. And it was like a campaign rally. The Polish president spoke for 10 minutes, but the entire event in Warsaw was organized by the Americans. That means the Polish side allowed the Americans, so to speak, to take charge of how then US President Biden's appearance would be staged. The Polish president spoke, and afterward there was a 10-minute break, so that for American viewers it would not be disruptive that some Polish president was speaking.
Sozusagen nicht störend ist, dass da irgendein polnischer Präsident spricht. Und dann kam Biden angelaufen, hat eigentlich eine Wahlkampfrede gehalten.
And then Biden came running up and basically gave a campaign speech against the backdrop of Warsaw's old town. Why am I telling you this? Because it simply shows what I mentioned earlier, that the perception in Poland is, and this was also conveyed, at least until Trump took office, that we are a symbiotic entity. We can even have a president whose son serves in the American military. And that is not a contradiction, because we are in fact symbiotic. Americans can campaign here. So that is very strong. In that respect, all of this and what I mentioned earlier is really, if you will, for those who need transmission belts, Poland offers itself in a fantastic way. I'm saying that cynically, of course.
In fantastischer Weise an. Ich sage das jetzt natürlich zynisch.
In anderer Weise zeigt sich auch die enge Verbindung.
Another indication of the close connection between Warsaw and Washington can be seen in the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline in the fall of 2022, which American investigative journalist Seymour Hersh attributes to his own country. And the Polish senior politician Sikorski, whom we mentioned earlier, responded with a tweet. He thanked America for the destruction, which Seymour Hersh attributed to his own country, the United States. How do you assess that?
Seinem eigenen Land, den USA, zuschrieb. Wie bewerten Sie das?
Ja, ich bewerte das so, dass Sikorski das aussprach.
Yes, I see it this way. Sikorski said out loud what anyone thinking soberly can basically figure out for themselves, even without the explicit background information that Seymour Hersh, among others, analyzed and presented. Information he was able to document specifically by using his contacts. Because, of course, the Americans have a major interest, or have always had an interest, in preventing too close a connection between Russia and Germany, and in a broader sense, between Russia and the European Union, led by Germany, or largely shaped by it. And in fact, Joe Biden announced the attack several months beforehand. You just had to listen carefully.
Einige Monate zuvor, man musste nur richtig zuhören. Und insofern, als Sikorski das getweetet hat,
and insofar as Sikorski tweeted that, you have to understand he has a narcissistic nature. Maybe everyone has that to some extent, but in his case, it's very pronounced. And I think he simply wanted to show spontaneously in that moment, I know this, and I can wrap it up with a punchline, so to speak. He was also genuinely pleased about it. 15 years earlier, he had already railed against the Nord Stream pipelines. Back then, when he was defense minister, he called it a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So yes, he simply said out loud what sober-minded people also felt, that the likely source was the United States, even if it was carried out, for example, by Ukrainian hands. But it did not happen without the knowledge and without the support of the Americans. Yes, but then he backed away from that position because he was harshly criticized. He deleted the tweet, but when asked, he kept saying essentially, yes, but at least the Americans knew about it. And it is known that the Americans are somewhere in the background. So that is the context. What is interesting is that in Poland, in the first few days after the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, it was actually blamed on the Russians. People said, okay, the Russians did it themselves, so that they would no longer have to supply energy in the future in order to harass Europe. Such statements were issued. Seriously.
Allen Ernstes sind solche Kommunikate da rausgegangen. Ja, aber
Polen hätte ja auch zumindest
Poland, too, would at least have benefited indirectly from low-cost Russian energy, from Russian gas, as part of the EU and part of the gas network. Is Poland also pursuing policy, pro-American policy, against its own interests?
gegen die eigenen Interessen gemacht?
ja, eigentlich schon. Das ist das, was ich ja vorher erwähnt habe. Also
Yes,
Europa als
basically.
solches
That's what I
macht
mentioned
ja
earlier.
gegen seine
Europe, as
eigenen
such, is
Interessen
pursuing
vor.
policies against its own interests. A fundamental interest of the European Union is and should be, and has been, that we find a way to coexist that is secured by treaties, economically, through economic interdependence and mutual dependencies as well. I use that word very deliberately. You are always dependent on something or someone. We are not going to produce the gas ourselves. The only question is whether we can diversify our sources enough so that dependence on any individual supplier country does not become too great. Because, of course, it is not wise to get 100% of your gas from Russia.
Gas aus Russland zu beziehen. Das ist politisch und auch ökonomisch dumm übrigens.
That is politically and economically foolish, by the way. But it is in Europe's own fundamental interest to organize peaceful coexistence with Russia, which would also pay off economically, by the way. And the groundwork for that had been laid. I also believe the Germans made a mistake with Nord Stream. Not the fact that it was built, but the fact that it was purely a German-Russian project. If the project had been made European, I think that could have been done through possible mechanisms, such as a European consortium, or by involving, for example, the countries affected by it. And one also has to keep in mind the history and the fact that, of course, the Americans will influence the Poles on this issue.
Dass natürlich die Amerikaner auf die Polen einwirken werden in dieser Frage. Also man hätte das von deutscher Seite klüger machen können. Ein europäisch.
Well, Germany could have handled that more wisely, a European-Russian gas pipeline project. But that's from another world. Still, as I said at the outset, it is a fundamentally European interest to have peace with Russia. That is not the interest of the Americans. And now, the history, the fears, and the background that are simply present and deeply felt in Poland can be used by all those who want to sow discord and then intensify that discord. Have I answered your question?
Ja. Habe ich Ihre Frage beantwortet?
Ja, sehr genau.
Ja?
Die Frage ist beantwortet.
Yes, very precisely. That answers the question. And in your book, With Russia, you argue for a change in policy, for a peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine, and for reaching an understanding with Putin, with Russia. The situation is completely deadlocked at the moment. How is that supposed to work?
Vollkommen verfahren. Wie soll das gehen?
Ja, ich glaube, im Moment ist es kaum möglich. Also das ist, diese Möglichkeiten
Yes,
gab's ja.
I think that's hardly possible at the moment. Those opportunities did exist. They existed before the war broke out, of course, simply to negotiate, because ultimately it was always really about whether or not Ukraine would be drawn into NATO's or the West's military structures. That was the central issue. And the American side knew that, as did decision-makers in Europe, that this was the key aspect. Russia spelled this out again in a kind of demand in December 2021, naturally with very harsh demands that couldn't be met. But it's also always about, so to speak, demanding the impossible in order to achieve what is possible.
Aber es geht ja auch immer darum, sozusagen das Unmögliche verlangen, um das Mögliche zu erreichen. Das ist ja die Basis von Verhandlungen. Dann gab es die Möglichkeiten.
That is the basis of negotiations. Then there was the opportunity in Istanbul, 1 month after the war began. That too was effectively torpedoed by the West, even though Russia and Ukraine had already come very close. And later in the course of the war as well, most recently through Donald Trump's initiatives, though he too had a somewhat misguided idea of it in some respects. But those were all starting points where negotiations should have taken place. I see no way out other than negotiations. At the same time, though, the situation has become so deadlocked that for both sides, for Moscow as well as Kyiv, compromises practically amount to defeat.
Kompromisse einer Niederlage gleichkommen. Denn im Hintergrund stehen natürlich.
Because in the background, of course, there are the massive casualties that are already the result of the war. And there is the hatred that has naturally arisen between the two societies, and in Ukrainian society, toward the Russian aggressors. All of that is already part of the political reality. or it has to be taken into account. And how any rapprochement could now be possible at the negotiating table is becoming increasingly difficult. What is important, of course, is that our perspective, meaning the European perspective, must actually step back from its maximum demands as well, just as the Moscow perspective must, of course.
Moskauer Perspektive natürlich. Und die Perspektive kann nicht mehr sein, Russland muss sich...
And the outlook can no longer be that Russia has to withdraw from the territories it has occupied, and so on, and pay war reparations. We have to formulate realistic goals. But honestly, politically, I don't see any point of contact. Unless the respective governments, meaning the leaderships in both Moscow and Kyiv, are overthrown, I don't see how they could move closer to each other. What I can possibly see is that there could be a revolt among the soldiers. Frankly, that is something I hope for, perhaps utopically, like what happened at the end of the First World War. On which side? Excuse me. On which side? Ideally, it would happen on both sides at the same time, because then, so to speak, both sides would... I'm speaking a bit utopian here, actually. You know, that's always what happens when I don't see any realistic prospects. But I say this because it has happened before. You know, at the end of the First World War, the Kiel sailors' mutiny had a major political impact. The soldiers said, "We're not going to keep fighting because this is pointless." And that spread like wildfire, and at least in Germany, ultimately led to Germany's capitulation.
Soldiers set off revolutions when they turn their guns around.
Yes, in the end, it is the soldiers who fight. You know, it's always the commanders, whether civilian or military, who give the orders. And ultimately, those orders are carried out by soldiers. And if soldiers mutiny now, then the orders will not be carried out. I know that may sound very naive, but I believe, I'm at least trying to do my part and make it public somehow, that ultimately it also depends on each individual whether they take part in the fighting or not.
I see few signs of that from the Russian military. I see numerous signs of disintegration and breakdown within the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian power apparatus. Do you see it in a similar way?
Yes, I haven't recently analyzed the Russian perspective, meaning what the situation is like in Russia itself, but in Ukraine, of course. We also have a great many Ukrainian men in Poland, and I have to tell you, some of those I spoke with were torn. That was especially true in the early years of the war. Should they go, or should they not go? Because expectations of them were simply very high, from their own compatriots, but sometimes also from my fellow Poles. You really ought to be fighting over there. And those who did not want to fight were torn. By now, I see it more this way. Those who are in the country have in fact decided that they want nothing to do with this war. And of course, I read the relevant reports about what the reality is like in Ukraine itself when it comes to mobilization, when it comes to forced mobilization out in the streets. Resistance is growing. And over the past 4 years, there have also been, I don't know the exact number of victims now, but quite a few Ukrainians have died while fleeing or attempting to flee across the border. That's one aspect. Another reality is that, of course, not everyone can buy their way out. Those who can afford it, who have the right connections in the authorities, and in some cases have the necessary means, can buy their way out, and they do not fight. And those who can't do that are mobilized. That, too, is reality. By the way, it's similar in Russia. And this is the perspective of the soldiers who ultimately have to die in these wars, as I see it. When we watch the TV news and hear statements from our politicians, but of course also from the Russian side, I see again and again that this perspective, that people are dying, is missing. They really are pawns on a chessboard for the politicians, including our politicians, in my view, in certain. And once again, the saying applies. The rich supply the weapons, the poor supply the corpses. Yes.
unser Außenminister Radosław Sikorski, der sich da gerne auch mit Witzen über die russische Armee äußert und dann gerne Lacher sammelt, aber dann nicht erwähnt, dass dort immer ständig Menschen sterben, konkrete Menschen.
Und wieder gilt der Satz, die Waffen liefern die Reichen, die Armen liefern die Leichen.
Ja, das hat sich leider nicht geändert, aber das ändert sich auch deswegen
Unfortunately,
nicht,
that hasn't changed.
wenn man
And it
es
won't
so
change if,
sagen
to put it broadly,
sollte,
poor people don't eventually say
Armen,
no.
wenn die nicht irgendwann Nein sagen.
Ein großes Risiko betrachte ich
One major
derzeit
risk I see at the moment is the toleration of Ukrainian drones flying over the Baltic region through Lithuania and also Estonia on their way toward Russia.
in Litauen,
What about
auch
Poland?
Estland,
Is that being quietly
in
tolerated as
Polen
well?
auch. Wird das auch stillschweigend geduldet?
Ja, das hat ja das hat keinen
Yes,
sozusagen
geographically that doesn't make any sense. At least I'm not
Also,
aware
das
of
ist
that.
wenig bekannt.
Poland lies
Polen
farther
liegt
west,
weiter
so that would play a
westlich,
role
Polen
there.
spielt das
Drones can fly long
also
distances.
das
They can also fly in
Drohnen können weit
arcs.
fliegen, können auch im
That's
Boden
why I
fliegen,
said that.
deswegen habe ich das gesagt.
das weiß
I
ich
don't
nicht,
know,
aber
but I'm not aware of any
diese
information about the extent to which that is being used. This was just yesterday, the day before yesterday. Yesterday, a suspected Russian missile struck Poland.
Mutmaßlich russische Rakete in Polen eingeschlagen. Also es spielt insofern die Verletzung des polnischen Luftraums oder
So,
die Nutzung oder die
The
Verletzung des
violation of
polnischen
Polish
Luftraums
airspace,
spielt
or the
eine Rolle,
use of Polish airspace,
weil das
matters
erste Mal
in
ist,
that this is
dass,
not the first time that flying objects, military flying objects, have been there in Poland, whether from the Ukrainian side or the Russian side. As I said, this missile was identified as Russian. But, you know, I'm also, I think, one of those people who doesn't really believe the official information from the authorities 100%, whether it was Russian or Ukrainian. I'm not saying it's wrong, or that it couldn't be the case, but I think that what is said is not always accurate, because there was also very contradictory information following a drone attack last year, in September of last year.
Sehr widersprüchliche Informationen gab. Man hat das den Russen zugeschrieben, dass es russische Drohnen waren, die dort in polnischen...
This was attributed to the Russians, that Russian drones had come down in Polish fields. At the same time, it became known, and the Polish military confirmed, that Belarus had warned Poland that drones were coming in there. So yes, I always view such reports very, very critically. But whether there actually are drone overflights, Ukrainian drone overflights, I don't know. But politically, I can imagine it, given the context of the Polish government's actions. Even yesterday, after the missile impact, they said, "We are not withdrawing our support for Ukraine, including military support. We will continue it."
Wie groß schätzen Sie
How
die
great do you think the
Gefahr
risk is of a full-scale European war, triggered, for example, by drone incursions, the seizure of ships in the Baltic Sea, or something similar?
Schiffen im Baltischen Meer oder ähnliches?
Wissen Sie, ich glaube, dass es nicht zu einem
You know, I don't think there will be a war, a major war in that sense, fought in the same way as the war between Russia and Ukraine is being fought. But I think this war, well, even though it sounds strange to say that when I always have the hundreds of thousands of dead in the back of my mind, to speak in those kinds of images, I think it will fray at the edges. In other words, it can actually escalate, but not into full-scale escalation. It's hard for me to describe exactly what I mean, but that is what I mean by fraying at the edges. Many small conflicts. If the Baltic states are now actually identified by Russia as places that are decisive in some way, for example, when it comes to bombing Petersburg, St. Petersburg, and so on, I don't rule out the possibility that this could also be the result of Russian actions. But I also don't rule out the possibility that it's a false flag. Because we also have to consider that Ukraine, if it wants to continue the war until a possible victory, or until whatever point the Ukrainian leadership wants to reach, has a natural interest in NATO countries joining this conflict. And I'm not saying that as an accusation against Ukraine. It's the normal behavior of an actor that knows it has to fight, and that it has supporters here, but they are only supporting it halfway, so to speak. We are supposed to support it fully. That's obvious. That would be a major relief for the Ukrainian leadership.
Und das muss man auch immer wieder mitbedenken. Also wir
And that
unterstützen
always
ein
has to be taken
Befreiungsland,
into account.
was illegitim
We are
trotz
supporting a
der
country that was
historisch
attacked,
illegitimen
an
Befreiung,
illegitimate attack,
was ein natürliches
regardless of the
Interesse
political
hat,
history
dass es
leading
nicht
up to it.
der
Naturally,
Rechtsstaat bleibt,
that
sondern
country
dass
has an
es
interest
bildet,
in not
dass es
remaining the
befreit
only
wird.
country
Und allein schon
involved,
das
but in having its
trägt dazu
allies
bei,
enter
dass,
this war.
dass die
That alone
Möglichkeit, dass dieser Krieg
increases the
ausweitet und
possibility
sich eben
that this
eben
war could spill
eskaliert,
over or
dann größer wird.
escalate.
Ich glaube, deswegen
I
ist
therefore
es
do not
sozusagen zu
believe there
einem,
will be a war,
ja,
an
einem
explosive outbreak,
explosionsartigen
because I believe
Vorfall.
Russia
Ich glaube, dass
would
da
then
tatsächlich
actually
die
play the nuclear card.
Reaktion ziehen würde.
And I
Ich glaube,
believe the
dessen sind
leaderships
sich
in the
die,
European capitals are
zumindest
aware of that as well, at least
inoffiziell sind
unofficially.
sich die Führungen auch in den europäischen Hauptstädten bewusst.
Wir wollen's hoffen.
We certainly hope so. What would be the three most important conditions for rapprochement, for peace in Ukraine? The three.
Die drei. Ich nenne Ihnen mal zumindest eine und dann schauen wir mal, ob ich dann
Let me
auf
give you at
Reserve
least
weitere
one,
nenne.
and then
Die
we'll see
erste
whether I
ist
can
die
name more on that basis.
Schwäche von
The
unserer
first is
Perspektive,
this. I'm
von der
speaking from our
europäischen, letztlich
perspective,
europäischen
from the
Perspektive.
Western European
Weil
perspective.
ohne uns,
Because without
jetzt
us,
letztlich auch
and
ohne
ultimately
uns,
without
ohne
us,
die
and of course
Amerikaner,
without the Americans,
kann die
Ukraine
diesen Krieg
cannot
auch
wage
nicht
this
führen.
war.
Oder
Without the
mit
resources
Militär
flowing
oder
there in various
verschiedener Form,
forms,
ob
whether in
Waffen
actual
oder
weapons or
finanziellen
financial aid, it
Fließen,
cannot continue
kann sie
this
diesen
war.
Krieg nicht
What needs to
weiterführen.
take hold
Dass
here
bei
is
uns
the
eine
realization
Perspektive
that we are
einsetzt,
not on the
dass wir
good
nicht
side
auf der
fighting
guten
evil.
Seite stehen
It is a
gegen das
basic
Böse.
prerequisite
Das
that
ist
we
so
ourselves
ein
acknowledge that we have
dass wir
supported a
selber
policy pushed by the
anerkennen, dass wir
Americans,
eine
a
Politik
policy that
mit
does
den
exactly what
Fragen
we
haben,
accuse the
von
Russians of doing,
Amerikanern forciert
namely,
wurde, die wir
being
mitgetragen
imperial.
haben, die genau das tut, was wir den Russen vorwerfen, nämlich imperial zu sein. Das heißt, unseren Einflussbereich zu erweitern.
That means
Und wir wollten
expanding our
das über
sphere
die
of influence,
NATO-Erweiterung machen
and we
und so
wanted to
weiter.
do that through
Und
NATO
deswegen ist die
expansion
erste
and so on.
Bedingung die, dass
That is
man
why the first condition
selbstkritisch
is that we
schaut,
take a
wer wir sind
self-critical
und welche
look
Politik
at
wir
who
in der
we are,
Vergangenheit,
at
in
the
der jüngsten
policies we
Vergangenheit
have
vor allem
pursued in the past,
getan haben,
especially the
um
recent
diese
past,
Politik
and
ändern.
change
Ich
those
glaube, das ist
policies.
die,
And I believe that is the
das ist
basic
die
prerequisite.
Grundbedingung. Also die zweite Bedingung
The
ist die,
second condition is that, from our perspective, and I don't want to get into the specific Ukrainian-Russian aspects of the war right now, but rather our perspective, because as the European Union and as individual member states, we are also important partners or supporters, that we must free ourselves from the United States in the medium and long term.
mittel- und langfristig von den USA lösen müssen. Und zwar, weil das die Grundbedingung ist, wenn wir hier
Because that
dauerhaft
is the
ein
basic
friedliches
prerequisite
Zusammenleben auf unserem
if we want to
Kontinent,
build
wo wir mit
a
den
lasting,
Ländern
peaceful
verbunden sind,
coexistence
unsere
here on
Rahmen
our
aufbauen
continent,
wollen.
where we are
Das ist,
connected with
glaube
the
ich, die
individual
zweite Bedingung, die
countries.
aber dann eher langfristig
I think
ist.
that is the second
Unser
condition,
Interesse
though it is
sollte
more of a long-term one.
sein, dass wir
Our interest should be to live together
Und das
peacefully,
ist nicht unbedingt
and that is
im
not
Interesse der
necessarily in the
Amerikaner, weil
Americans'
das
interest,
bedeutet, dass wir
because
als
it means
integrierter
that, as an
Kontinent
integrated continent,
auch
we can also
weniger
manage with less
US
U.S.
Einfluss nehmen
influence.
können.
So those are the
Ich würde
two
diese
conditions
beiden
I would
Bedingungen
name.
nennen.
And the third might be
Die
that
dritte
greater
wäre vielleicht,
resistance is
dass
actually
tatsächlich
expressed
eine
among the
Bevölkerung
population,
ein größerer
because I do
Widerstand
believe that can have an
formuliert wird.
impact.
Weil ich glaube schon, dass das auch Einfluss haben kann. Wir haben ja das spanische Beispiel, dass
We
die
have the
spanische
Spanish
Regierung
example.
sich da
In the context of
während
the
des
Iraq War,
Irakkrieges
the
ganz
Spanish
entschieden
government
gegen
took
die
a
USA
very
gestellt
strong
hat.
stand
Sie war
against the
die
United
einzige
States. It was
europäische
essentially the
Regierung, die
only
das wirklich
European
so scharf
government that
formuliert
put
hat
it
und
that
auch die
sharply,
Konsequenz
and
gezogen hat.
also drew the
Wir dürfen
consequence.
keine Basen
You are
in
not
unserem
allowed to
Staatsgebiet
use your
errichten
bases
können
on our
und so
territory
weiter.
for this war.
Übrigens sich auch die
Incidentally,
spanische
the
Regierung
Spanish
in
government
Gaza
also
engagiert,
took
im
a very
Gazakrieg
clear
und bei der
position in the
Bevölkerung
Gaza
dort auch sehr
conflict,
klar
the war in Gaza,
positioniert hat.
and the
Und
genocide
das
there.
liegt auch
And that
daran,
also goes back to the
dass in
fact that
der
there is greater
Bevölkerung
resistance
es da
among the
größere
population.
Widerstände gibt. Das zeigen
Polls show that,
Umfragen, das haben
but
aber
so
auch
have demonstrations, the
Demonstrationen,
size of the
größere
demonstrations in
Demonstrationen in
Spain.
Spanien gezeigt,
That can also
dass das
influence
auch
political
Einfluss
leaders.
haben kann
So
auf die
perhaps that is the
politischen
third
Führungen. Insofern
condition,
ist das vielleicht
that
die dritte
resistance from
Bedingung,
below
dass
becomes
unten
stronger.
eben der Widerstand stärker wird, ja.
Eine Anerkennung der westlichen
The
Mitverantwortung.
Polish journalist and author Jan Opielka calls for recognition of the West's shared responsibility for the war in Ukraine, for Europe to distance itself more from the United States and pursue a policy guided by its own interests, and for greater public resistance to the policy of war. Thank you very much for that. We should also remember that Warsaw is, I believe, the only capital city in the world with an airport named after a musician, Frédéric Chopin. You are a musician as well, so we will conclude this conversation with a song you requested. Because here at Gegend and Strom, we present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep silent about. Here you go.
welche die Propagandamedien verschweigen. Bitteschön.
Ja.
Yes, it's a piece that I wrote. It was inspired, in fact, by the war in Ukraine, by the soldiers, and by the men who came to Poland, who I talked about. They were torn. They didn't know whether they should fight, and some of them did go off to fight. And I thought about who is actually fighting on the front lines, who dies on the front lines, and who does not.
Stirbt und wer das nicht tut. Und ja, in mir ist eine riesige Wut einfach.
And yes, an enormous anger arose inside me. And that applies not only to the Ukrainian soldiers, of course, but equally to the Russian ones being sacrificed there, just as young men have been sacrificed in past wars and likely will be in wars to come, for interests that are highly questionable, to sum it up. And then this song came into being. It was initially written in Polish, but I later translated it into German as well. And it is called Black Sea.
Deutsch übersetzt und heißt Schwarzes Meer. Schwarzes Meer ergießt sich aus den Lippen gebrochenen Krug.
A black sea pours from the lips in the broken jug. You run, you play, you aim, your finger on the safety off trigger. There, in the darkness, a shooter shouts, loudly commanding, "Listen to me." Because if you don't kill him today, he'll kill you tomorrow. It's hard not to believe this. Harder still to resist. But hardest of all, to say no. It is difficult, but there is no sorrow in not being in a war.
Nicht deinen Krieg zu sein. Das Grenzland blutet in Flüssen des stummen Nichts klingen.
The borderland bleeds rivers of blood. Blows fall without a sound, blind and deadly. Produce more weapons, they demand. It is about freedom, theirs, ours, supposedly. At the center of the camera flashes, they call for courage, because they do not mean their own. We will win the just war. You will win it only through death and agony. Because then it is hard not to believe this, harder still to resist. But hardest of all, to say no. It is difficult, but no cause for grief, to be in no war. In front of certain flags, they blow up the meaning and dream of democracy. Degrade, falsify, encode 01, suck the oxygen out of the room. They proclaim their values, yet conceal the catastrophe's true core. The capitalist triad that contains, exposes, and unleashes exploitation and power shatters the system's sinking star. It is hard not to believe this, harder still to resist. But hardest of all, to say no. It is difficult not to be a pawn in their game. The Black Sea carries young hearts away in coffins. The destroyer draws nearer. Pain breaks like black waves in brown murder. After the second, the third hour strikes. A new morning drives the night of the worlds into infinity. This time, it collapses, infects, multiplies, deciphers this myth in deadly attire. It is hard not to believe in it, harder still to resist, but hardest of all to say no. It is difficult, but be no pawn in a war that is not yours. Be no pawn in a war that is not yours. Be no pawn, not in your war. Do not die, human being, in a war that is not yours. And do not kill, soldier, in a war that is not yours. In the blackness of the sea, war sinks, not yours. In the blackness of the sea, war sinks, not yours. In the blackness of the sea, war sinks. It is not yours. Sink the war. Sink the war. Sink the war, because it is not your war. No, it is not your war.
versenkt den Krieg, versenkt den Krieg, versenkt den Krieg, versenkt den Krieg, versenkt den Krieg. Denn es ist nicht dein Krieg. Nein, es ist nicht dein Krieg. Nein, es ist nicht dein Krieg.
No, it is not your war. Human being, do not die. Human being, do not die. Human being, do not die. And soldier, do not kill. Do not be a pawn in a war that is not yours. Do not be a pawn in a war that is not yours. No.
Nein. Danke sehr.
Thank you, Mr. Bob. And to say this once more, it is dedicated to all soldiers, explicitly on both sides, in Ukraine and in Russia. On both sides, ordinary people are dying.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Dank. Gerne.
Certainly. Thank you for the conversation and for the invitation.
Einladung.